There have been many famous anarchists throughout the long history of the movement. There have been writers and intellectuals like Kropotkin and Reclus. There have been fighters and martyrs like Bresci and Novaccioli. But we should be careful not to hold people on a pedestal. Perhaps nobody better exemplifies the core ideals of anarchism than Errico Malatesta. An organizer first and foremost, he always found the most practical ways to directly further the movement without sacrificing his ideals. While he never wrote long treatises or essays, his short pamphlets, at the time intended to be accessible to those of all backgrounds, still remain clear and direct while other texts begin to show their age. And throughout his decades of exile and imprisonment, well into his old age, he always remained kind, accessible, and unwavering in the values he held so close. But enough preface.
Errico Malatesta was born December 4th, 1853, to Federico Malatesta and Lazzarina Rostoia in the small Italian town of Santa Maria Capua Vetere. His family was minorly wealthy, owning a few houses at the city. His first exposure to radical politics was in 1860, when the Bourbon monarchy began to crumble around him and talk of a republic was in the air. Mazzini wrote of an Italy without kings, and Garibaldi, at first, fought for it. At the age of 6, this fight was brought directly to Malatesta's hometown, as Garibaldi himself fought a Bourbon army near the city. This made his home, for a brief moment, the focus of Europe's attention. It's not known how this experience affected him due to how young he was, but Max Nettlau, someone interesting in their own right, one of the best anarchist historians, and someone I'll be referencing a lot later, claims that this experience, no doubt, had some influence on him. Where Malatesta really developed radical ideas was during his experience in school. At the age of 14, he was sent to Naples. During this time, he met another young student, Saverio Merlino, who soon became a friend of Malatesta. Malatesta would soon be introduced to Republican politics, believing that the monarchy was corrupt and needed to be overthrown and replaced. Soon after, while he was still 14, he was faced with his first arrest as he wrote and signed a threatening letter to King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy. His father, who held somewhat liberal ideas, did his best to try and free him. He talked with all the minor officials he knew in the city to make it seem like the whole incident was just some massive prank. After being detained for a night, Malatesta was released with a strict warning from a local official. Luigi Fabbri, who was a close friend of Malatesta, who also wrote one of the biographies I'm using, goes into a little story about this incident. And the night after he was released, his father confronted him, trying to get Malatesta to at the very least hide his radical ideas. But Malatesta, in a bit of teenage rebelliousness and a bit of his personal unwavering commitment, held firm. Eventually, and defeated, his dad, with tears in his eyes, proclaimed, "My poor son, I hate to say it to you, but you'll end up on the gallows." This story offers a brief glimpse into Malatesta's character, something which will become clearer throughout the story. His strong shift towards Republican values was, as he admitted, a combination of his strong beliefs for equality and freedom, along with ignorance of what Republicanism really represented. Quote, "I paid closer attention and became aware that an enormous injustice, an absurd system were weighing down humanity, condemning it to suffer. Work was degraded and nearly past dishonorable, the work of dying of hunger to feed the orgies of his idle master, and my heart was swelled with indignation. I heard it said around me that the Republic was the negation of these things which tortured me, that all were equal in a Republic, since from everywhere I always saw the word Republic mixed with all the revolts of the poor and the slaves. Since school we were kept in ignorance of the modern world in order to be made stupid by means of a mutilated and adulterated history of ancient Rome, and were unable to find some type of social life outside of Roman formulas. From these reasons I called myself a Republican, and this name seemed to resume all the desires, all the wrath which haunted my heart. I did perhaps not very well know what this dreamed republic should be, but I believed that I knew it, and that was sufficient. To me, the republic was the reign of equality, love, prosperity, the loving dream of my fancy transformed into reality. Later on in reflection, I studied history, which I had until then learned from stupid manuals full of lies, and I then saw that a republic had always been a government like any or worse, and that injustice and misery ruled in republics and in monarchies alike, and that in both of these, the people were shut down by cannon when they tried to shake off its yoke. Still in his youth, and before coming to this realization, he was an eager Republican, enamored by Mazzini and Garibaldi's promises of revolution and true change. In 1870, he along with many other Republican students were arrested in Naples during a crackdown on radical action. This prevented him from returning to his studies. This, however, wouldn't stop Malatesta, and in fact did the opposite. His politics were always more important to him than official gain, and with the typical paths of life now blocked off to him, he began in truth his life as a revolutionary. He tried then to join the Universal Republican Alliance with his friend Leon Cavello, but was rejected since they were thought to hold dangerously socialist tendencies, with the party claiming that they would soon defect to the International. Unknowingly, this claim became one of the first times that Malatesta had ever heard of the International. One of the most groundbreaking events for the entire socialist movement of this time was the Paris Commune of 1871. It cast a long shadow on the international socialist movement, greatly defining its future. While the Commune was short-lived and while it was much less of a socialist utopia than it was made out to be by some at the time, it was nonetheless monumental. It proved to be an inspiration for thousands, spurring them to action. The Commune is one of the many things claimed to be Malatesta's real push towards anarchism, and even if it wasn't, it was undeniably a profound experience in shaping his thought. Carmelo Palladino, a radical lawyer, introduced him to the International, though is ominously described in Nettau's biography as dying tragically and secluded later. Regardless, Malatesta would soon after join the Italian section of it. He would later in his life explain in depth his disdain for republicanism in articles and pamphlets. He saw how in America slaves were compatible with the Republic, how in Switzerland various parties took much of the control supposedly in the people's hands, and how the French Republic didn't stop the brutal crackdown of the Paris Commune. But with this disillusionment, he began his life as an internationalist.
Non sia scampo all'odiato borghese che alla fame e agli stracci insultò.
One of the most influential figures in the Italian section of the International was Michael Bakunin. Throughout the late 1860s and early 1870s, Bakunin campaigned around Italy, spreading the International and gathering many supporters to his form of anti-authoritarian socialism. One of the most important people to join Bakunin's ranks was Carlo Cafiero. Cafiero deserves a video himself, but I'll do my best to summarize here. He was born in 1846 to what Nettlau describes as a rich and reactionary family. He was seemingly sick of the status quo from the early stages of his life, but this often manifested in the most bizarre ways. During his childhood, he was enamored by religion and mysticism. His family thought he'd be a priest, so sent him to seminary. However, he very quickly began to despise the place, and while his interest in religion wouldn't go away that quickly, he began to detest Catholicism, believing it was a repressive force in Italy. In 1864, he began to study law in Naples and took up a very short-lived career in diplomacy. He began to detest that as well and abandoned his diplomatic career. He then flung through a variety of interests, including Far Eastern languages and Islam. Eventually, he got caught up with radical groups in Florence, being introduced to Marxism and the International. He was enamored by Marx and Engels' ideas, and he was taken up by them as the champion of Marxism in Italy, as all the other major Italian figures followed Bakunin's beliefs. On the 12th of May, 1871, he was sent by Marx and Engels on a mission to report on the situation in southern Italy and also spread Marxism in the predominantly anarchist region. He initially did this with great zeal and enthusiasm, but began to have some doubts and questions. There are very few industrial proletariat in southern Italy, with the vast majority being poor farm workers. In addition to this, while the conditions were ripe for social change, conditions were very different from Germany and England, where many of Marx's theories originated. He began writing to Engels about his doubts, who assured him to continue his mission. Eventually, upon meeting many of the Bakuninists he was sent to remove, he began to think that they weren't all a threat to Marxism and should instead be cooperated with. He wrote this to Engels, who promptly told him that it would be better to get rid of them entirely, claiming that they were dissenters, not interested in the people's well-being. Cafiero responded once more, claiming that Bakunin was a quite noble man and that there isn't any reason why they shouldn't work together. After this, Engels stopped responding entirely. Around 1872, he eventually abandoned his Marxist principles entirely, joining the ranks of the anarchists. With this, he became one of the most dependable and loyal anarchists available in Italy. But enough about Cafiero, because much larger things were in work at this time. I mentioned before how the Paris Commune inspired many. This is true, but it also proved to be a marked shift in the movement. The debates over tactics between various socialist factions intensified, new outlooks arose, and everyone was wondering how the next Paris Commune could be used to greater effect. This, combined with the often inconsistent and inaccurate reporting about the Paris Commune at the time, meant that many people were unduly pointing blame at each other for the Commune's failure. While a split between Marxists and Bakuninists was growing for the years before this, the fallout of the Paris Commune intensified it. The split in the International reached its boiling point with the infamous Hague Conference of September 1872. The Hague Conference had so many things outside the scope of this video building up to it, and due to its highly political nature, many motivations and justifications are still debated to this day. I think Nettlau describes this strange situation best in a quote that, though from the 1920s, is still very applicable today. Quote, "It is not feasible to explain here the story of inner dissensions of the International, nor even the echo they found in Italy, with anything near their completeness. These are not old forgotten party squabbles but debates, moves and counter-moves which bear great resemblance to those of our very time, and it is regrettable that some only, Malatesta among them, have this past chapter of socialist history and experience before their mind, while to many others it remains completely unknown, or worse than that, distorted by partial accounts, to use a mild term, which have been disproved long since but which are always carelessly revived." As a result, I'm not going to go into depth about this very controversial issue, but what's important is that it marked the final split between Marxism and anarchism. Paranoia between Marx and Bakunin had reached such a height that both were absolutely convinced that the other was planning a grand conspiracy to oust them and destroy the International. It ended with Bakunin and many of his followers being expelled under highly dubious circumstances, prompting outrage from many sections of the International. In the wake of this, and in the same month, many Bakuninist members of the International organized the St. Imier Congress in the hills of Switzerland. In this time of rapid change, the youngest attendee of the St. Imier Congress began to see the spotlight, Malatesta. However, the trek to Switzerland wouldn't be easy for Malatesta. Throughout his whole life, he suffered from severe health problems, most notably chronic bronchitis. Though he always acted energetically, doctors claimed that he wouldn't live past 24. After making his way through the mountainous country, he finally made his way to Bakunin's house in Zurich. After this, he collapsed in a fever. This would be the first time Malatesta met the old Bakunin, the semi-legendary figure who played such a pivotal role in the early anarchist movement. Malatesta, undoubtedly frustrated, spent most of his time immobile and barely conscious. Bakunin, for his part, did everything in his ability to help aid the recovery of Malatesta. The two very quickly developed a close relationship, with Bakunin being impressed with the young man's vigor despite everything seemingly being against him. Still, at night through the dark halls and away from Malatesta's ears, Bakunin lamented with the others over how severely sick he was. In one particular instance which Malatesta overheard, Bakunin whispered, "Too bad he is so sick. We will lose him soon. He hasn't more than 6 months left." Malatesta later reflected on these days, saying, "It would almost have been a crime to die when there is so much to do for humanity. I felt happy to have the man's esteem and promised myself to do everything to merit it." This he would do, as, to everyone's surprise, he began to recover, still in time for the Congress. After this, he would return to Bakunin's house in Zurich until late September. Malatesta's friendship with Bakunin would only grow, taking part in discussions lost to time with the old anarchist in the aging halls of the Ballata. As Malatesta would reflect nearly 50 years later, quote, "It was impossible for a youth to have contact with him without feeling himself inflamed by a sacred fire, without seeing his own horizons broaden, without feeling himself a knight to a noble cause, without carrying out high-minded objectives. And this happened to all who fell under his influence." Just as with Cafiero and Andrea Costa, Bakunin saw in Malatesta something to keep that sacred fire alive. This tight-knit group of prominent anarchists became informally known as the Alliance. So with this simple interaction, Malatesta was elevated within the highest circles of the anarchist movement. The Congress met in the city of St. Imier. It was attended by 5 federations of the previous International, with delegates from Italy, Jura, Spain, France, and America. Among those in the Italian Federation were Errico Malatesta, Mikhail Bakunin, Andrea Costa, and Carlo Cafiero. After a few days of discussion, all of the federations agreed on 5 declarations. I initially included them in this video, but basically me reading them verbatim and I was already running low on time. I have instead added a separate video if you're interested. But basically, it agreed on an anti-authoritarian platform, believing that essential institutions shouldn't dictate the movement. It agreed on the autonomy of individual groups to act however they see fit, and it agrees that the abolition of political authority is necessary for a truly free society. This was a truly pivotal moment in anarchist history, and firmly established anarchism as its own unique and distinct form of thought. It set a lot of things in motion going forward, and Malatesta, though very young at the time, was there to witness it. Speaking of Malatesta, he returned to Italy soon after the Congress. Not too much is known about his personal life at this time, or at all really. As Fabbri and Nettlau repeatedly say, he never let his personal life bleed into his political life. There are, however, a few things we know. It's unclear to me when exactly his parents died. Nunzio Pernicone, an Italian anarchist of 1864 to 1892, claims that, quote, his father, mother, sister, and brother had all died of lung disease by 1870. Fabbri's version doesn't necessarily contradict this, it just sort of implies that they died around the mid-1870s instead. Regardless, he was left with a decent inheritance, but quickly spent it all on the movement and to help other comrades in need. From this point on, and throughout the rest of his life, he was extremely poor and lived as a mechanic and electrician. Around this time, though likely earlier, he also met Amelia Tronzio Zanadelli, who he would have a relationship with for some time. It seems like they both met through her brother back when he was in college and continued to meet as they became more and more roped in with the socialist movement. Malatesta, always shy to go into his personal life, didn't really explain much more in depth, and therefore the rest is for the most part speculation. During roughly this time period, he was beginning to make a major name for himself. He was well liked by other anarchists for his straightforward determination, and his friendship with Bakunin propelled him even higher in the circles of Italian anarchism. But this brought some unwanted attention to him as well, especially from, you guessed it, the police. In early January of 1873, a Congress for Italian anarchists was planned in the small town of Mirandola, 19 miles away from Modena. The location was chosen as it was close to where the Soretti brothers Celso and Arturo lived. Celso was an early supporter of Garibaldi turned anarchist, and I couldn't really find any information about Arturo. The Congress was supposed to be held on March 15th. The police found out what was going on and arrested many of the delegates. The Congress was held regardless, declaring itself to be atheist and materialist, and anarchist and federalist. Unfortunately, among the many arrested were the Soretti brothers, Malatesta, Andrea Costa, and Carlo Cafiero. This was part of a general crackdown on socialist movements at the time, with the government declaring the International the criminal body. They used this as the basis for the charges against the anarchists. However, this apparently didn't hold much sway over the courts, as Nettlau claims, quote, "The tribunal had not yet endorsed these government views, and the arrested were all discharged after 2 months in prison." I'm not exactly sure what he means by that, but I'm, not very familiar with 19th century Italian law. However, this would definitely not be the last time Malatesta would be suddenly released, or as often happened, arbitrarily convicted on some weird quirk of the Italian legal system. Anyway, the delegates, including the inseparable Malatesta, Costa, and Cafiero, were released in May. He went to meet his friend Bakunin shortly thereafter, visiting him in the Ballata, Bakunin's house near Lugano, Switzerland. He stayed there for a few weeks in July of 1873, where Bakunin and Malatesta eagerly heard promising news from Spain. According to Nettlau, quote, "During the summer of 1873, Spanish Revolution seemed imminent, and finally, urged on by his Spanish friends, Bakunin resolved himself to go there. Convinced of the urgent need to reach Spain, he planned a trip. However, it very quickly became clear that neither of them had the funds to reach Spain. Someone, however, did. Carlo Cafiero. Remember how I said Cafiero came from a, quote, rich and reactionary family? Well, the inheritance for that proved invaluable to the other comrades, who were very often flat broke, and Cafiero, the committed revolutionary, was usually more than happy to help. However, Cafiero was busy with unspecified things in the town of Ballata. However, due to the revolutionary nature of the operation, Bakunin couldn't simply write to Cafiero, so instead he gave Malatesta a task: reach Cafiero and explain the situation as soon as possible. Malatesta eagerly accepted, immediately setting out towards Cafiero. A few weeks later, he finally arrived in Ballata. Unfortunately, he only had a few days to convince Cafiero because Malatesta was suddenly arrested without any explanation.
Nostra patria è il mondo intero, nostra legge è la libertà, ed un pensiero, nostra patria è il mondo intero, nostra legge è la libertà, ed un pensiero, ribelle ancora ci sta.
He was taken to the town of Trani and immediately locked up in jail, and what will be the first of many arbitrary and extended arrests. Frustrated but not undeterred, Malatesta began sneaking letters out of the jail to inform his friends about the situation. However, these were found by the police and Malatesta was punished. He was sent to a special part of the prison called the Tower of Diavolo, where he was isolated from the other prisoners. In addition to this, he was constantly monitored by an assigned guard to stop him from sending any more letters or sneaking anything out of the prison. It seemed like he was finally trapped. Unfortunately for the government, they probably should have vetted their guards a bit better because the one assigned was, to say the least, a little bit eccentric. The guard was previously a Republican revolutionary arrested in a military prison when the Bourbon monarchy still ruled southern Italy. In a series of events that became strangely common through Malatesta's life, the guard quickly became enamored by Malatesta and befriended him. The guard, in addition to being arrested by the Bourbons, was previously a member of Silvio Spaventa's cabinet during the mandate to annex southern Italy from the Bourbons. However, due to some bizarre circumstances, he and his cabinet was expelled from power. The guard, to say the least, did not appreciate working for the government who expelled him, and also did not appreciate his loss of stature. In fact, he appreciated it so little that he not only wanted to kill the minister, but was sharpening a dagger at the end of each day for this purpose. Now you may ask, how do we know all this? Well, he told Malatesta all of it during his stay in jail, even proudly showing Malatesta the dagger he planned to use for the assassination. This wasn't the only person he befriended, however, as the director of the jail, Carlo Battistelli, also became sympathetic to Malatesta's cause after multiple discussions with him. As you can imagine, basically nothing was done to stop Malatesta from smuggling letters out of the prison to his informer's friends about the situation. As Fabbri points out in his biography, these are not isolated instances. Almost everyone who begins to know Malatesta, even in adversarial positions, seems to, for whatever reason, befriend or at least respect the man. He spent nearly 6 months in jail this time, before being suddenly released without a trial and without being informed what he was accused of. He was fairly lucky in befriending the garden director as he wasn't beaten or abused in jail. However, as Fabbri says, the greatest harm done to him there was the great amount of time being wasted, time which was extremely valuable in the turbulent times of 1870s Italy. Still, being released as suddenly as he was arrested, he made his way to his comrades. Upon his release, Cafiero immediately met Malatesta in Naples and informed him of a planned insurrection throughout Italy. It was organized by Andrea Costa and led by Bakunin, being Bakunin's last major revolutionary effort. Cafiero purchased dozens of rifles and pistols, and Malatesta eagerly rallied people to their side. Bakunin was to lead the major revolt in Bologna, while Malatesta and a few others were to revolt in the south and rally others to follow the model of Bologna. It was meant to be a widespread insurrection, with Garibaldi apparently telling Bakunin that he would aid them if it grew to become a major event. This, however, would not happen. As Nettlau explained, the movement had a few major issues from the beginning. Quote, it depended on a multiplicity of pre-arrangements, appointments, a given order of initiatives, etc., and a few arrests or accidents obstructed this complicated mechanism. It could not have been ready for action when the popular riots took place, for the rifles, as the trial shows, appear only to have been acquired in the latter part of July. Whether Cafiero's journeys, where he contributed most of the money, caused any delay, I cannot say. It's extremely likely that the example of Bologna would have been followed in many other localities where preparations had been made. As it is, all was probably done in most places to undo these preparations and destroy their traces. Some say that Costa was too optimistic and too superficial in reckoning upon support promised. The initial ferment and immediate question attracting the people and rousing the indifferent was evidently wanting, and everything fell flat. The revolt was to happen mid-August. However, Costa was arrested before the insurrection even began, and Bakunin was hunted down before sneaking out of Italy disguised as a priest. With this, the northern portion of the revolt was dead in the water. The southern front with Malatesta did a bit better, initially retaining its composure, but that faced major issues as well. He was going to reach the meeting point until he was warned about a police assassination plot. He then took all of the possible side roads until he reached the meeting point, the old Castel del Monte. However, Malatesta found out, well, I'll let Malatesta explain himself. Quote, several hundred conspirators had promised to find themselves at the Castel del Monte. I headed the reunion, but at the meeting place, of the hundred who had sworn themselves in, we found 6. It didn't matter, the box of weapons was open. It was full of muskets. We armed ourselves and declared war on the Italian army. We crossed the countryside for several days trying to take farmers with us, but found no response. The second day we encountered 8 soldiers who believed we were a much larger group and they didn't open fire. 3 days later we realized that we were surrounded by soldiers. There was nothing else to do. We buried the muskets and decided to scatter. With this, the revolt was a complete failure, and a failure that greatly tarnished the reputation of the International in Italy. Bakunin especially was ashamed of the result, and it strained his relationship with Cafiero. When looking back, it does seem almost doomed from the start. I can't speak for myself, but I'll put Fabbri's note on the topic here. Quote, today all this might seem puerile, but it wasn't in those times. Still full of recent memories of the attempts by Mazzini, Garibaldi, Pescara, and so on, in which the smallest initiative spoke with such suggestive power, while hostility towards the government was so great, the governing power of the new dominators still weak, and the loyalty of their own people still uncertain. The intentions were enormous, and from these were derived an optimism full of exaltation and a deep seriousness. Regardless, this was not to be the new Marsala expedition, and the revolutionaries were forced into hiding. Malatesta attempted to reach Switzerland and was successfully hid for a few days before being found in Pesaro. He was arrested and interrogated by the police. It was clear that if he remained silent, he'd get severely beaten for refusing to speak, as they heard he shot at the soldiers during the rebellion. So instead, he proclaimed that he had extremely valuable information that only the judge could hear. The soldiers obliged, transferring custody to the judge. After this, he claimed that invaluable information was how he was being detained unjustly and he knew nothing of the insurrection. He avoided a beating, but unamused, he was locked in what Fabbri described as a type of iron cage for ferocious animals, which was at the patio of the barracks. Eventually, the Italian government began formal proceedings against him and the other conspirators, transferring them to a permanent jail. A jail which he wouldn't ever be able to escape. A jail completely isolated from other prisoners. A jail, perhaps, elevated above the ground to make it even harder to escape. And, you guessed it, he was brought back to the same tower as before. The same director, Battistelli, proclaimed upon seeing Malatesta, "Oh, you've gotten yourself trapped." The trial's defense, taking place in 1875, was aided by Malatesta's friendship with Battistelli, who allowed him to freely communicate with his lawyer. It very quickly turned from a serious trial with serious consequences into a propaganda campaign, as it became clear all the jurors were on the revolutionary side. The revolutionaries had a cheerful and enthusiastic attitude and repeatedly criticized the Italian government for hypocrisy. Costa used the opportunity to go on long and fiery speeches painting the revolutionaries as freedom fighters who will stand strong regardless of the verdict. The government prosecutors attempted to paint them as violent thugs trying to rampage the countryside, but the defendants stood in courageous defiance, yet remaining gentle and sympathetic. Even though the insurrection was definitely committed by Malatesta and the others accused, almost everyone in the jury and the general public became sympathetic towards them. Eventually, it ended in a general acquittal, with 11 of the 12 jurors siding with the accused. A few of the defendants were convicted for violent acts committed during the revolt, but it was for the most part a shocking and beneficial result. Cafiero at the time put it aptly. If only the government would multiply the trials. They may cost some of us years of prison, but they will do our cause immense good. Looking back, it is a bit bizarre how they were all acquitted, but Pernicone, in his book Italian Anarchism 1864 to 1892, explains his opinion. Quote, many considerations influenced their decision. The previous acquittals, most recently of the Roman internationalists at a retrial of May 18th, the presentiments that the left's triumph would herald a new era of toleration, the incompetence of the prosecution, the testimony of renowned character witness, the skillful defense of Stornelli and other attorneys, the sympathetic press coverage of the trial, and certainly the dignified demeanor of the defendants themselves, young workers and idealists who hardly seemed to fit the government's description as dangerous malefactors, and who already had spent 19 months in prison for an undertaking easily dismissed as an insignificant escapade. However, the larger pattern of leniency towards the internationalists in Bologna and elsewhere must be attributed above all to the jurors' ignorance of socialism and the potential threat that it represented for the bourgeois, as well as to the mood of disapproval for government policies that pervaded Italy at this time. Malatesta said as much later. Quote, we were absolved despite the most explicit declarations of anarchism, collectivism, and revolutionaryism, because the bourgeois, especially in the Mezzogiorno, did not yet feel endangered by socialism, and it was very often enough to be enemies of the government to appear sympathetic to these types. Pernicone then ends with an ominous note, simply stating, this naivety on the part of the Italian bourgeoisie did not survive the 1870s, perhaps a sign of things to come. Upon being released, around September of 1875, the anarchist crew in Italy began to quickly reorganize itself at the Ballata. There was, however, a bit of drama. Cafiero, through his time in prison, time financing the revolt, and the large amount he spent to purchase the Ballata for Bakunin, had become absolutely broke. He and his wife were living in near poverty, with the also poor Bakunin not really able to pay back anything Cafiero gave to him. This, combined with Bakunin's role in the failure of the revolt and other personal disputes, greatly strained the relation between Cafiero and Bakunin. Malatesta attempted to reconcile the relationship between the two old friends, but to little avail. Fabbri claims the dispute wasn't too personal, and that the two still exchanged letters after. However, the split was still definitive. Malatesta remained at the Ballata for a short time, staying by the side of the now aging Bakunin. This time, however, it became increasingly clear that Bakunin no longer had the energy to continue his life as a revolutionary. Constantly sick, and with his health rapidly failing, Bakunin wouldn't have any more grand ambitions of a revolt. He stayed only for a bit, discussing a few scattered plans with the old revolutionary, including the ever-elusive goal of a Spanish revolution. After this, he returned back to Italy. This would be one of the last times he met his old friend, who he had first met nearly 5 years ago. He would meet Bakunin once again on July 1st, 1876, and would turn out to be his last visit. Shortly after, the famous figure, unwavering revolutionary, and close friend of Malatesta, would die.
Tutti gridavano l'odio e il furore, forse Giovanna il vestito vedeva, in quella folla tra tanto colore.
I don't want to give too much praise to the man. There are certainly some very horrible things he said and wrote about, most notably his constant and rampant anti-Semitism. But his death was undeniably a turning point. During his life, anarchism began to define itself as a truly distinct movement. Every moment was filled with an energetic anticipation, and the revolution always seemed like it was just around the corner. After his death, the movement began to gradually change, as it should. Bakunin and others of his kind provided some of the basis for anarchist thought going forward, but one of the best choices following his death was the name of anarchism itself. Rather than being ultimately tied back to one figure like Marxism, anarchism did not become Bakuninism. It's a movement much greater than a single person can hold, and that became abundantly clear after his death. So for anarchism, his death marked an undeniable change. For the Italian crew, Bakunin's death marked an equally great change. Bakunin had been instrumental in the spread of anarchism in Italy, and was a large reason why it was so popular in the first place. With his death, the first and oldest chain of the alliance would break, and with it, only Costa, Cafiero, and Malatesta remained. And for Malatesta, more than anything else, a good friend was lost.
Difendeva un ragazzo già morto, ma quel che conta è che a uno di loro un San Pietrino la testa sfasciò ed ha scontato 20 anni in prigione perché un gendarme si è rotto la testa. Ormai Giovanna ha 3 figlie in pensione, chissà se ha visto il vestito da festa. Ormai Giovanna ha 3 figlie in pensione, chissà se ha visto il vestito da festa.
But Malatesta, like always, paved on regardless. Before Bakunin's death, and shortly after Malatesta's second-to-last visit in 1875, Bakunin tasked Malatesta with what would be his last revolutionary mission from the old anarchist. Fittingly, it was a mission to Spain, a trip they had been discussing for years but had been stopped each time. But this time, there was a very specific objective in mind. Charles Alarini, a friend of Bakunin who helped him escape arrest in 1870, had been arrested himself in Spain. Bakunin wanted to repay his old friend, but was too old to do it himself. Malatesta accepted, and headed to Spain shortly after. I'll let Nettlau explain this one, since he has a pretty good retelling. Quote, of this journey, which took place that autumn or a little later, Malatesta speaks in a humorous spirit. The local comrades at Cadiz considered the rescue very easy. Malatesta was immediately admitted at the prison as if he had entered a hotel, and passed the whole day with Alarini. Finally, Malatesta boldly asked the chief warder to let Alarini walk outside with him and see the town. A few pieces of gold in the warder's hand, and the next day, Alarini, in the company of 2 warders, was permitted to join Malatesta. The comrades had arranged for a ship. The warders were made drunk, but Alarini hesitated and would not go. There was nothing left that night but the considerable trouble for Malatesta and Alarini to restore the drunken warders to their home. On the following day, Alarini seemed more disposed to go away. This time a single gold coin and the 1 warder were sufficient. A sober man this time, but upon whom a sleeping draught appeared in the evening. Alarini was free to go and seemed determined to leave, but was found lingering in a room outside and simply would not go. So, Malatesta gave it up. Alarini may have in fact had a local sweetheart, or was disinclined to re-enter revolutionary life. His time was over, in fact. After this, Alarini almost seemed to vanish off the face of the earth. He moved to Egypt in the mid-1870s and was never heard of again. Malatesta then goes on a few other escapades. This is getting a lot longer than I thought, so I'll just summarize the less important ones. From October 1875 to April 1876, he was part of a Freemason branch. I'll just let Malatesta explain the circumstances of it himself. Quote, I returned to Naples with a certain level of popularity, and the Mason wanted me among them. A proposition was made to me. I objected to my socialist and anarchist principles, and in response was told that Masonry used for infinite progress and that anarchism could very well enter within its program. I said that I could not have accepted the traditional form of the oath, and was told that it would be sufficient for me to promise to struggle for the good of humanity. I also said I was not willing to submit to the ridiculous probations of the initiation, and was told that they would be disposed within my case. Briefly put, they wanted me at any cost, and I ended by accepting from these reasons. Also that I was struck with by the idea of repeating Bakunin's attempts, which he had failed, to lead back Masonry to its original ideals and to make a really revolutionary society of it. So I entered Freemasonry, and became quietly aware that it served only to advance the interests of those brethren who were the greatest frauds. But since I met there with enthusiastic young men who were accessible to social ideas, I stayed there to make propaganda among them, and I did so with great scandal and rage of the big heads. As you can probably imagine, Malatesta calling the leaders massive frauds and trying to siphon away members to socialism caused some issues with the higher-ups. Eventually, Malatesta decided that fighting an uphill battle in a secret society wasn't worth it, and just left once a particularly hostile Mason was put in charge of the local lodge. As Bakunin found out years before, the Freemasons had no use in revolutionary politics. He tried aiding the Herzegovinians in their insurrection against the Turks, but this ended poorly. The first time he tried to go, he was arrested by the Hungarian police near the Sava River after the Italian consulate warned them of him. He was then forced to travel back to Italy on foot, and arrived nearly starving to death in Italy a month later. The second time he traveled to Serbia with the same goal, but this failed too, and eventually he just returned to Italy. He returned to Naples shortly thereafter, and began reorganizing the movement there. During this time, an important event would happen. The Italian Internationalist Congress was going to be held in Florence on October of 1876. Of the many things the Congress was going to be about, one of the most important would be the economic nature of their anarchist movement. Most of the delegates attending were fine with just sticking to Bakunin's collectivism. For those who don't know, collectivism is basically a type of anarchism where the means of production are held in common, but labor vouchers determine how much stuff someone gets. Basically, it tries to eliminate the hierarchical structures of capitalism by having the goods in common, but keep the incentives for labor by having it rewarded. Again, with Bakunin's legacy in Italy being so strong with very little differing views on the subject, this was sort of taken as a given by most of the delegates at the time. However, a few of them disagreed and sought to find a new way forward. The most influential of these would be the Old Alliance, Costa, Cafiero, and Malatesta, along with Emilio Covelli. who I haven't mentioned before, but should sort of be an honorary member of the alliance. He was a friend of Cafiero, went to the same school, he was a major proponent of anarchism in the First International, probably the one who asked the rest of them about economic positions in depth in the first place, and all around a really cool guy. Cafiero, Govelli, and Malatesta met in Naples in the months leading up to the conference, and began to discuss specific economic goals of anarchism. Costa wasn't there, as he was part of the correspondence commission to get the conference set up. Anyway, they began to see cracks in the collectivist orthodoxy. They first wondered who would distribute these labor vouchers. It sort of implies some sort of authority that, even if decentralized, poses a potential threat to the anarchist ideal. This could be excused if it was absolutely necessary, but they wondered if people would really just stop working if there wasn't some implicit threat. They brought up the case of disabled people, who collectivists already agreed to be taken care of even if they couldn't work. Then they asked why not extend that to everyone else if it was possible for some in the first place. Otherwise, wouldn't the weak end up being dominated by the strong as discrepancies begin to expand themselves? At that point, you might end up with a new privileged class exerting their weight on those below them, rendering pointless the whole goal of anarchism. Basically, they thought that the collectivist order was based off an unnecessary requirement and threatened the existence of a truly anarchist society. So in these discussion-filled walks alongside the warm coasts of Naples, they agreed on a communist form of anarchism. As the conference drew closer and closer, the danger from the police grew more and more. The members of the Correspondence Commission arrived before the rest on October 20th to set everything up. However, they were intercepted and arrested by the police, who prohibited the Congress and occupied the spot where it was supposed to occur. With some of the most influential delegates, including Andrea Costa and the rest of the Correspondence Committee, arrested, it seemed like the Congress was doomed. However, they wouldn't let this setback stop them. They tried to go to a small town a few miles away from Florence, but the police found them there as well, so instead, they all went to a nearby forest that they used as a makeshift meeting ground. Side note, if anyone's holding a massive anarchist congress in the woods, invite me, because that sounds pretty dope. Anyway, the main topic of the Congress is whether to adopt the idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs into the program of the Italian International. Other than that, they reaffirmed the anarchist nature of the International and disapproved of the use of electioneering for their cause. After this, they wrote protests about the prohibition of the Congress and demanded the release of those arrested. Another Congress was held a bit later with pretty much the same conclusions. As for Malatesta and the Alliance, there would be one more major revolutionary project with them, one which would define Malatesta's early career, and one which is still talked about in some circles today. Once Malatesta and Cafiero returned from the Congress, they would immediately begin their planning. In the province of Benevento, they would stage a massive uprising, one that would hopefully have more success than the failed one a few years earlier. The goals are also a bit different. Rather than actually trying to start a revolution like the failed insurrection before, the goal was to make a major propaganda victory. By this time, they sort of realized it was highly unlikely this would turn into a nationwide revolt, but still, they wanted to galvanize the poor rural population of Italy and make them more sympathetic to the anarchist cause. It was a demonstration more than anything else. This is a pretty common technique at the time. Some of you might know it. It's called propaganda of the deed. As Fabbri put it, quote, "There's a fundamental distinction between the movements of 1874 and the one in Benevento, which Cafiero and Malatesta helped stage in 1877. The first promised to unleash an insurrection throughout Italy, while the second had more of a demonstrative character of making propaganda by deed. The movements of 1874 were prepared and inaugurated in several parts of the peninsula. In 1877, on the other hand, the actions were specific to the Matese countryside and the Benevento province. Naturally, we shouldn't overlook their hope that the movement would evolve and extend itself, as Malatesta had always put, quote, 'Deeds bring about deeds.' But the concrete objective was to herald the revolution by example, regardless of what the eventual practical outcome might be. However, one major issue, like always, was the funds. Quote, 'Above all, the time was occupied in search of the financial means, pledges, and so on for the projected insurrectionary attempt. Malatesta and Cafiero struggled to find manual labor in order to earn something, but in vain. Always with the object of finding money, they made an escape to Neuchâtel, where they first met with Peter Kropotkin, although they didn't obtain anything. Until, unexpectedly, Cafiero came up with 5,000 or 6,000 francs, the last of his possessions. 15 in this, plus a minor sum that a Russian socialist had put at his disposition earlier, constituted a war fund for the revolutionary movement that was prepared. There was a bit more to it than this. There was some weird situation with this Russian lady who gave them money in the hopes they would help buy her lover's freedom from jail, and there was also the scheme to get that same lady to marry Kropotkin because of some weird Russian law where she needed to marry a suitable Russian nobleman to get the rest of her inheritance, which she would then give to the revolutionaries. But it's not too important. I don't want to go overcomplicating things. Basically, they had less money than they wanted, but it kind of worked out. If you want to read more about it, there's an account in quote in the History of Italian Anarchism, 1864 to 1892. Anyway, with this they began their preparations in full. One thing of note was that Andrea Costa, who contributed so much to all the previous movements, was against this one and didn't take part. It's definitely interesting, and for those who know what's ahead, perhaps it's a sign of things to come. But anyway, let's not get too ahead of ourselves. The preparations started strong. They were building up a stockpile of weapons and gaining the support of local farmers. However, issues began to arise shortly after. One of the people they used to gain the support of the farmers was the well-known local Salvatore Farina. He convinced many of the legitimacy of the movement and helped turn large swaths of the population to their side. However, he turned informant and betrayed everyone to the police. Malatesta and Cafiero avoided arrest, but only barely. Still, they continued planning. Sergei Stepniak, a Russian revolutionary, joined their ranks and helped build up for the second time. However, after Farina's betrayal, it became a lot harder to organize and suspicion filled the air. Stepniak and Malatesta rented a house in Cerrato with the company of an old Russian woman who would be used to distract the police. They pretended the house was to help the woman recover, but it was really being used as a weapons depot. The police eventually caught wind of this, and on April 3, 1877, a skirmish broke out between some soldiers and members of the insurrection. After this, a series of arrests got most of the planners, and only a quarter were still available for the plot. Still, they decided that it was now or never. In the middle of the night, stationed in the mountains, the 30-man strong Banda del Matesi began the revolt. The first town they entered was Lentino. Flying the red banner, they entered the town hall. They declared the king's authority vacant and occupied the town council. They then burned the official tax records, occupied the treasury, and then distributed money and weapons to all the townsfolk. They spoke before the townspeople, urging them to join the cause and throw off the shackles of oppression. They were listened to receptively. The local priest, Raffaele Fortini, made a nice little speech claiming they were the true apostles sent to preach the word of Christ. I don't know how well this went over with the Catholic Church after the revolt, but onwards. Anyway, they did the same thing as they did in Lentino, burning the tax registers, distributing goods, and raising the red flag of the town hall, anything to stick it to the government and rally people to their side. They were definitely met receptively in both towns, but as Fabbri and Nettlau point out, there was an air of suspicion. In Gallo, when holding a conference to urge the townsfolk to join the revolt, one of the farmers asked how they knew the revolutionaries weren't just soldiers in disguise sent to trick them. This was heightened by the fact that most of the revolutionaries were northerners, while the revolutionaries in the south. Those who didn't doubt the motivations of the revolutionaries were still hesitant to join, fearing their own safety. The combination of this meant that while almost all the townspeople welcomed the revolutionaries, very few went out to join them. While this was happening, soldiers became aware of the events and began closing in. After the revolutionaries left town, they found that they were surrounded. They were blocked from behind with a nearly unscalable mountain, and soldiers were arriving from the front. They debated making a last stand, but the pouring rain made the powder and their weapons useless. They decided to stay united, but attempted to hide out in the surrounding countryside. They took refuge in the small village of Cacetta, but a local farmer informed the soldiers of their position. At midnight, the soldiers struck and arrested the remaining revolutionaries. They were all arrested and imprisoned near Benevento. This was seemingly a more dire situation than in 1874, especially since a soldier had been killed in the events. They were held throughout 1877, but luckily, due to the death of King Victor Emmanuel II, a general amnesty was granted to all political crimes in the turbulent country. There was, however, still some question whether the death of the soldier was a political crime or not. So, they were still held in Benevento and put on trial in 1878. The by now veteran revolutionaries, like always, realized the propaganda opportunity of a publicized trial like this and used it to their fullest extent, trying to rally as many people to their side as possible. Anyway, remember Saverio Merlino, that one law student and Malatesta's friend during his days at the University of Naples? Well, once he saw in the newspaper that his old friend was on trial, he set out to defend him. Over the course of the trial, the previously politically indifferent Merlino, with maybe slight leaning towards republicanism, very rapidly joined the ranks of the internationalist anarchists. With his help, all of the defendants were acquitted, and Merlino went on to write an article about the trial later that year. I also didn't mention Merlino at the beginning of the story for no reason, and he will play an important role later on. Overall, the revolt was an undoubted propaganda success and embarrassment to the government. The fact that all the defendants were released was only salt on the government's wounds, and as it would soon become clear, with the official means of punishing Malatesta out of the way, they would harass him in any means possible through the most arbitrary and borderline illegal measures. Side note, this is the beginning of this weird trend that even Malatesta noted, where he manages to escape jail every time he does something actually serious and definitely illegal, but is then convicted of the most bogus and arbitrary charges later on. Fabbri has a good quote about this, that though talking about events much later in his life is equally relevant here. Quote, he accepted risks, but he didn't look for them without reason, and took all of the necessary precautions without exhibiting useless fears. He sometimes took precautions that others around him, not understanding their causes, found exaggerated, especially when he was simultaneously working on some other initiative, or when the risks could implicate third persons. In reality, he didn't lack the shrewdness to fool the police investigations, but most of his shrewdness consisted instead of his spontaneous geniality and naturalness, of hiding as little as possible or not at all. Like, for example, when he lived for 9 months in Ancona incognito, and while the police looked for him everywhere, he tranquilly strolled about the city, frequented all the public places, and went where he liked with the only precaution of not being seen in the street together with the better-known comrades. The truth is that Malatesta, during 50 years, had mixed himself up in a quantity of small and large acts and movements of revolutionary and subversive nature. He had been imprisoned an infinitude of times, was always under suspicion, and often tried, since the police intuited his effective presence everywhere. However, he had almost never been caught, as it is said, with his hands in the bag. He might be the Italian revolutionary who, having done the most, was convicted the least, barely 2 or 3 times in all of his long life, and unjustly then, that is to say, without evidence and for acts that weren't his or which didn't constitute a crime. I have been convicted only when I was innocent, he jokingly told me one day, but not without a hint of malice. Anyway, while the revolt was a major propaganda victory, it showed the limitations of this type of revolution in the modern day. It would mark the first of Malatesta's truly major revolutionary acts, and with it would mark a change in his thought. He would never lose his insurrectionary spirit, but he began to look towards other, in his opinion, more effective ways to bring forward the revolution. After this is when his ideas truly become distinct and radical, diverging from the status quo in the anarchist movements at the time. But that is a story for later. As this project grew more and more, it's become obvious that I'm going to have to split this into 3 parts. I'll go over his ideology more in the next video, as that is when he really starts developing his ideas. Don't worry, I'm not going to leave you guys hanging. I'll try to release part 2 in a month and part 3 a month after that. Anyway, enough of that. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope to see you again.